Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Farah Kilidar, and I'm the CEO of the World Affairs Council. Wonderful to see a full house. We've been actually really waiting for this event. We've been planning for it for a number of months now. And in order not to waste any further time, I'm going to skip the announcements and leave them till the end of the event and go ahead and introduce our speaker for the day, Maajid Nawaz. Maajid is the co-founder and chairman of Quilliam, a globally active think tank focusing on matters of integration, citizenship and identity, religious freedom, and extremism. In a nutshell, Quilliam works to provide a counter-narrative to Islamic extremism. A British Pakistani born in Essex, and I suppose for those of you who've been to England or grew up there, you'd know what that indicates. But anyways, radicalized at the age of 16 to join the Islamist group Hizb al-Tahrir. This then led to him being arrested in Egypt post 9/11, shortly post 9/11, I think it was December, and imprisoned for almost 5 years. With Amnesty International adopting him as a prisoner of conscience on the premise that whilst they might disagree with the extreme ideology he was holding, he had not committed any crimes, had not carried out any violence. That turned his world around. By 2007, Nawaz renounced his Islamist past and co-founded Quilliam at that point, calling for secular Islam based on liberal democratic values. Maajid has since risen to become a prominent critic of Islamism in the UK, which is a lot more on the rise, and I'm sure he'll be talking about that, than it is in the US. He is a regular op-ed contributor and commentator, has published his autobiography, Radical, My Journey Out of Islamist Extremism, which is a must-read. And today he will be talking to us about this journey and about his views as to what's going on currently, be it in the Middle East, be it in Europe, with extremism on all fronts, but specifically on Islamic extremism. So please join me in welcoming Maajid Nawaz.
Thank you. So we speak from here and then we'll sit there afterwards. Thank you, Farah, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for spending an evening here to hear me speak about such a serious topic. I wish to thank the World Affairs Council. It's my first time in Houston. I'm having a great time. And I wish to thank those of you who've come from afar to participate in this conversation today. As I was walking in today, the gentleman just sitting there, is it Janine?
No, Jesse.
Jesse. Just sitting there, said to me he's driven 4.5 hours to come and attend. So, you know, it really is, it's touching because it indicates to me that there's a growing awareness about the need to have these sorts of conversations, these sorts of dialogues with a level of nuance and the seriousness and the attentiveness that they need. Now, as you've heard in the introduction, there's a reason why I've committed myself and my life to the cause of advocating for liberal, secular, human rights-based, democratic, civic engagement among my fellow Muslims. And the reason is because having spent 13 years of my life on the other side of this debate, arguing for the exact opposite, I felt the need not simply to resign my post and pursue my education in law, combining it with the Arabic language to take up a potentially lucrative career in the Gulf among Arabs, pursuing the interests of commercial law, but instead felt that actually that would have been the easy way out. I felt that I needed to take responsibility for a lot of the ideas that I helped to propagate. As you heard, the group that I joined is called Hizb al-Tahrir. I joined at 16 years old, and this group was the first to popularize the notion of resurrecting a theocratic caliphate among Muslims. It was founded in 1953 in Jerusalem. And though, as Farah mentioned in her introduction, it's not a terrorist organization, and hence it remains legal in the United States, across Europe, in Britain, where I'm from, and in Australia and Canada, it's still active and it's still legal. Because a bit like, the comparison between, say, Marxists and those of the Che Guevara bent who take direct militant action, Islamists have those divisions as well. Hizb ut-Tahrir was and is a revolutionary Islamist organization that seeks to impose a version of Islam, the religion, over society, but instead of using terrorism as a method, it seeks to infiltrate the institutions of society and thereby affect public opinion, and secondly, infiltrate the militaries of Muslim majority societies to incite military coups. And they are very serious in this pursuit. Now, those countries in which they were and are inciting military coups, by and large, were dictatorships, which is why it made it difficult in the West to prescribe this organization. Because, of course, he or she who overthrows a military ruler or a dictator, such as Saddam Hussein or Hosni Mubarak, isn't necessarily viewed as a criminal in the democratic West. So the group was able to exploit the freedoms and the democratic values that we all hold dear via this loophole to proselytize for the notion of resurrecting a theocratic caliphate among entire generations of Western born and raised Muslims. And so my work in founding Quilliam in 2008 and then spearheading the world's first public initiative in this way to form an organization that's sole purpose is dedicated to pushing back against the Islamist ideology was to take responsibility for my role that I played in advocating and popularizing the notion that one is duty-bound as a Muslim to re-establish this theocratic caliphate. Because matters, as you know, ladies and gentlemen, matters have come to such a head that now groups such as ISIS have declared this caliphate and its return. And we see what that means for the victims of those who have to suffer under the yoke of their rule. How did I come to that realization and thankfully abandon my conviction, my dogma, in the Islamist ideology? Before I proceed, I think it will help to give you a very basic one-line definition of what I mean by Islamism. What I don't mean is the religion of Islam. And I need to make that very clear, because of course we've witnessed across certain cities in the United States, but also in Europe, those who choose to intimidate ordinary Muslims who are going about their business by turning up outside mosques in full military fatigues, armed with guns, intimidating worshippers. My target is not the religion of Islam, though I am not devout. I must make that very clear as well. I don't hold myself up in any way to be a religious role model. Any of you who have been following me closely in recent months would have seen that one of the right-wing tabloid newspapers in the United Kingdom took great delight in filming and publicizing my stag night. And thankfully, I'd always maintained in public that I'm not a religious figure anymore. And therefore, but I do need to make this very clear, that my aim is not the religion of Islam, nor its devoted followers. What I mean by Islamism, in one sentence, is the desire to impose any version of the religion of Islam over society. It's the desire of imposition that I take issue with. And that's why I call it Islamism. And the suffix ism there to denote the politicization, like with communism, socialism, or even liberalism. It denotes a political ideology. The desire to impose over society is what I take issue with, and what everyone who subscribes to human rights, civil liberties, values will rightly take issue with. And Islamism has its strands. You know, there are the political Islamists who seek to come to power via elections, groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood. Then there are the revolutionary Islamists, such as the group that I used to subscribe to, who seek to come to power via revolution, or one clean sweep to overthrow a system. And then, of course, there are the terrorists who use violence to bring about this ideology. And so if Islamism is the desire to impose any one version of Islam over society, jihadism is the use of force to spread Islamism. These are the definitions that I adhere to, that I use. Of course, everyone can have their own. But just so I'm clear, when I refer to Islamism and jihadism, that's what I mean. And so our purpose in founding Quilliam was to act as a focal point, to act as a symbol for those who want to resist this ideology, by changing public opinion and raising awareness around what this ideology really stands for, and exposing its leaders, its ideologues, and exposing its tactics. And we founded this in 2008. And really my journey to kind of departing from my previous dogma began in prison, as Farah mentioned. What I've avoided doing tonight is giving you the chronological order of my story and my journey, You heard some of that in the introduction. You can read the rest of it in my autobiography. It's called Radical. And so I'll spare you having to recount a lot of that. But my move away from the dogma, it started in prison. And really, for me, a formative period of my life, which produced the man that stands in front of you here today, was the 4 years I served in Mazar' Torah prison in Cairo. I was sentenced to 5. We served our full term, which should have been 3 years and 9 months, but it took the Egyptian government the extra 3 months, because we served just over 4 years. It took them an extra few months to process the paperwork and release us. One usually serves what they call talat arba' al-mudda in Egypt, which means 3/4 of the sentence. In the United Kingdom, it's half of the sentence. In Egypt, it's meant to be 3/4 of the sentence. But we were the lucky ones. Though we served a few months over our allocated time, I can assure you I spent many years in prison with Egyptian political prisoners who had been sentenced to 10 years and were in their 15th year, or those who had been in prison for 20 years without charge and without conviction. Those were called the mu'taqalin. Now, we hear a lot in Western liberal media, and rightly so, about Guantanamo Bay. We hear a lot. But actually, what goes on in Arab prisons is far, far worse. And I personally befriended people who had been in prison for over 20 years, never knowing what their charge was and never knowing when they would be released. And they were in surprisingly good mental health, though I'm sure I wouldn't have been if that's something I was subjected to. But really, my formative years in developing my activism now began in Mazar' Torah prison. The interesting thing with Egypt under Hosni Mubarak was the following. That in this prison with me were not only some of the leading figures of global jihadism at the time. IS now, of course, ISIS have eclipsed the old, what I now refer to as the classical jihadists. You know, the nostalgic days when you knew at least bin Laden, wasn't going to enslave women. That's how bad things have become. But in those days before ISIS, those who were the leading jihadists of the day were in prison with us. The assassins of the former president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, from a group known as Tanzim al-Jihad, which was the mother group behind Al-Qaeda. They were in prison with us, as were liberal political prisoners. Ayman Noor, Saad ad-Din Ibrahim, who's now, he's married to an American, I think he's now based in the States. He was an Egyptian professor, sociologist, lecturing at the American University of Cairo, who was also in prison during that same period. And on top of that, there were Christians who'd converted to Islam, and Muslims who'd converted to Christianity, and homosexuals, those who were accused. Of course, they insisted they were accused because they couldn't admit they were gay. The infamous Queen's Boat case, they were all thrown in prison in this same prison. And so there was a running joke at the time in Egypt among us prisoners, among us political prisoners at least. We said that in Egypt, under Hosni Mubarak, because we had the Christians who'd converted to Islam, we had the Muslims who'd converted to Christianity, we said, in fact, Mubarak's view is if you change your mind from anything to anything, you end up in prison. But you can imagine the very rich conversations and debates that we had in that Mazar' Torah prison. There was me as a young 24-year-old. When I was imprisoned, I was 24. And there was me face to face with the assassins of the country's former president, with those who are liberals and those who were just for being gay were thrown into prison. And we were having these everyday, really rich and interesting conversations. And I learnt one thing. Any of you who are familiar with George Orwell will know the reference I'm about to make. Animal Farm is one of those books that is timeless, I think. And Orwell, in fact, his vision for kind of what can happen in the future with totalitarianism and dogma is a timeless vision. And I really felt like those 4 years I was living in the jihadist version of Animal Farm. And I came to the conclusion that actually, whereas in Animal Farm, and it's a take on communism, and the pigs come to power and take over the farm, I thought to myself, if these guys ever create this caliphate that they're talking of and came to power, then truly the pigs would be running the farm. And so when I was released from prison in 2007, I came back to the United Kingdom, and I felt that I was unable to sustain the lie that was the Islamist ideology. And I knew that if these people came to power, and the reason I knew that is they were having conversations about slavery and the return of slavery when they established their so-called caliphate. But because it hadn't been declared yet, they weren't enslaving women. So I predicted in 2007 that this is how this phenomenon would end up. It would end up being a return of the darkest days of human history that we've ever known. And I no longer could sustain or justify to myself my leadership position in an organization that was crucial in popularizing the caliphate. So I resigned. Thank you. I resigned in 2007. And when I talk about responsibility, it was the feeling of responsibility that I needed to dedicate my energies and any of the gifts that I have blessed with by God, to dedicate those energies to challenging this ideology. And that's hence we founded Quilliam. And really our mission statement, our purpose, is to do the following. Many of you here will remember when the USSR was still a power, a global power. And the reason I say many of you will remember is precisely because it no longer is. And so our mission statement is to render the Islamist ideology as unattractive, as unappealing as Soviet communism has become today. Now that's a grand mission statement, and I know, and I'm certainly not naive enough to think, that this is something that's going to happen tomorrow, or even next year, or even in the next 10 years. This is a generational struggle, but this struggle cannot be won through the blunt tools of law or war alone. Those two blunt instruments, law and war, have their place. There is a place for counterterrorism legislation and there is a place for military intervention, but they will never be the long-term solution. We need a perestroika moment among the Islamist ideologues. And it's through that perestroika moment, the Gorbachev-led perestroika that led to the collapse of the ideological conviction in communism, that needs to happen among Islamist ideologues. And that's what we are trying to initiate. And in the final analysis, any social movement that's reached that stage of a global insurgency has 5 key components. And I'll end on this point, because I'm sure Farah and many of you have many questions. A social movement has 5 key components: ideas, narratives, leaders, symbols, and goal. The goal, the end, the dream. And so if you look at the Islamist ideology, we know what their ideas are about. You know, this desire to establish a form of Islam, to rule by Sharia law. This is what they believe in. We know what their narrative is, their propaganda, the second factor. We know what that is because we're subjected to that narrative, to that propaganda every day. We know who their leaders are. We see them. You know, images of bin Laden are etched into our memories. We know who their leaders are. We know what their symbols are. We know what their iconography is. The black flag is ubiquitous. And we know what their goal is. It's to resurrect a theocratic caliphate. So these are the 5 that come to form the social movement of Islamism. And any social movement has those 5. Communism had the same. There's a reason why, even until this day, certain people wear Che Guevara on their t-shirts. And in fact, if we had Facebook and Twitter back then, we would really have seen how many people Che Guevara executed at point-blank range with his pistol. But we don't see that, so we romanticized it. But those are the 5. Now, my thought experiment, the note I'll end on is the following. We will never fully find our way through the mess that is the contemporary Middle East and Muslim majority societies, and actually, sadly, European Muslims. We'll never find our way through that mess unless and until all of us in this room have an immediate answer to the question I'm about to ask you. Because those are the 5 that come to represent the Islamist ideology. Who here can think of even one of those 5 factors for democratic activism today in the Middle East? Do we know who the leaders of democratic activism in the Middle East today are? Do we know what the symbols and iconography is for democratic activism in the Middle East? What is the propaganda, the narrative for such activism? What is the end goal, the vision, the dream for democratic activists in the Middle East today? And the fact that it's difficult for us to even think of one of those 5, even one of them, tells us how bad the situation has become. And we will not find our way out of this until and unless the ideas, the narratives, the leaders, the symbols, and the dream for young Muslim Democrats arise, organize on the grassroots, and start in the form of a social movement having the same level of impact that we witness for Islamist ideological activists today. And that's what we hope to begin, even if we don't see the end of it. Thank you very much.
The timing was perfect. Thank you very much, Maajid.
Everybody has to be a productive part of
When
society.
I
And everybody
picked up Maajid this morning to take him to... Oh, hello. Is that better? No. Speak loud. Okay. Any better? All right. Okay. Thank you. Well, I actually want to start by saying you spoke of selling out and not taking the commercial law route. I obviously sold out and did exactly that.
I won't hold it against you.
Right. It took me about 20 years to sort of smarten up and end up here. So you were ahead of me on that front. But we went to school today and you spoke to a few students who, one that stuck in mind was a young man who had moved from Iran to Houston 3 years ago. Yeah. And he was talking about the conflict he found between what he was taught in school, the narrative in school, and what he experienced at home with his parents, who were very liberal. And to a point that he felt that his parents were going to burn in hell, because you hear that narrative since you're young, and then he comes out to the US and realizes no, the narrative is actually quite different. And I'm sure that's not just true of Iran. I'm sure that's true of, I know that to be true of many countries and not just in the Middle East. Yes. How do you deal with that?
This reminds me of a story. The way I am, many questions and conversations remind me of stories. So if I will raise my voice so you can all hear me clearly. Is that okay? I was, precisely the same way, I was in conversation in London just before I left Hizb ut-Tahrir. In the 10 months it took me to leave after coming back from Egypt, I was on a panel. And the panelist, and this was obviously a panel ostensibly organized for us to propagate our ideological convictions. And on the panel with me was this young African-American recent convert to Islam. Now, I, as a 15, 16-year-old, was very much into hip-hop. I grew up on Public Enemy, on NWA. So I was, even in my Islamist kind of, admittedly towards the end of my Islamist period, I was still rather chuffed. I don't know if you use that word here, rather impressed to be on this panel with this particular man. He was one of Tupac's bandmates who'd been in the same group as Tupac. Outlaws, they were called. And this guy's rapping name was Napoleon. He probably still is. And after Tupac's untimely death, this man became a Muslim. But the type of Islam he converted to was a very, very rigid literalist, is a very, very rigid literalist, let's call it Saudi form of Islam. I won't call him an Islamist, because I don't have any evidence that he wanted to impose that on others, but he personally was quite rigid. And on the panel, somebody from the audience asked him what he thought happened to his friend and colleague, the man who was responsible for his very fame and his position being on this panel talking to people in England. The only reason he was there is he was touted as Tupac's former Outlaws member who'd converted to Islam, and listened to how good that is. And this man had the audacity to sit there and say, in response to the question, somebody in the audience asked him, where do you think Tupac is now after his death? And he said, his lifelong best friend. And he sat there with a straight face and said, he's burning in hell. And it's this literalist mindset that we heard from this young man today, not from him, but what he was taught in Iran and what he then had the wherewithal and the intellect to move away from, because he was a questioning and very intelligent young man. And unfortunately, not everyone is as fortunate as him to be able to, first of all, leave that society and come here, but also just to be that skeptical of what the received wisdom is in their societies. And this is what's going on, not just in Iran, but actually across the region, with the rise of religiosity. And as Islamism rises, even the traditional Muslims who are in competition, in direct competition with Islamism, are finding that they're having to reassert their own religiosity even more, because now there's a competition over who has the claim to Islam itself. So the net result is fundamentalism is on the rise across the board, across all sects. And we see that playing out in Iraq and Syria with the sectarianism that's on the rise there as well. It's a very unfortunate situation.
It's interesting because actually I forgot his name, that young man's story, Hamid, there you go, reminded me of a story myself. I mean, that's in Iran. We expect that in Iran. We probably maybe, expect it in Saudi. But I remembered even going to school for a few years in Abu Dhabi in a private English school. But you were still, obliged to study religion. If you were born Muslim, you're obliged to study. And I was taught at the age of 11, we were discussing that, the torture in the grave. You get tortured in the grave before you go to hell, just as a precursor. And the impact that had, the fear that instilled in me as an 11-year-old. And, that was back in the 80s, when things were nowhere nearly as bad. I dare not think what the narrative is right now, because you speak a lot of the narrative and the power of the narrative. So my question is, how do we take possession of that narrative? Right now, it would seem to me that the Islamists are in possession of that narrative. That
certainly, that narrative does need to be reclaimed. And it's not just Muslims, though Muslims also have to step up and fulfill their role and their part in this intellectual struggle. But actually, to continue with the analogy of communism, everyone in society has a role. Journalists, policymakers, politicians. I've come from Colorado Springs, where I gave a talk just before here, and one of the guests at the dinner with me owned a local soccer club. And he said, well, I'm in soccer, I'm in the soccer business, what role could I possibly have? And I said, well, actually, really, think about it. Think about the role sports played, for example, against apartheid, with protesting apartheid South Africa, and the role that sports diplomacy played and does continue to play, and played with China, and thawing relations and all of that. There is always a role when we're locked in what I describe essentially as civilizational struggles, not the clash of civilizations, because actually this is a struggle within Muslim majority societies for civilizational values. It's not a clash between Muslims and others. We're witnessing even within these societies, Muslims themselves who are struggling to reassert democratic values and are falling prey to, are the first victims of terrorists such as ISIS. So that narrative needs to be reclaimed. How do we do that? There needs to be a political side to this. There needs to be an intellectual side to this, and also a theological side. Now, of course, the theological side will be done by Muslim theologians, which is not me. But we at Quilliam support such theologians. We're a secular organization, but in the vein of promoting pluralism within theology, we bring on board those Reform theologians and support them and subsidize their research into developing new Reform narratives, reconciling concepts of citizenship with traditional notions of Islam, for example, which is the latest paper we just released yesterday, in fact, on that topic. But I from a more, let's just say, a public commentary level, have been engaging in this dialogue as well. So here in the United States, you have one of the prominent neo-atheist critics, Sam Harris, who is pretty much that we have Richard Dawkins in Britain, and Sam Harris is kind of like the Richard Dawkins, the Christopher Hitchens of the US. And he and I have been locked in dialogue about the future of Islam and tolerance. In fact, that's become the title of the dialogue. And he asked me these very questions, is it possible that Islam can find its way out of this current situation, or is Islam an inherently violent religion that renders it impossible for a reform to take place? And that's the dialogue we engaged in. And he's probing me, and I'm responding and arguing actually that there's nothing fatalistic, there's nothing definite about the situation we find ourselves in. And to spare you the details, it's another book you can buy. The short answer is the following. The fact that ISIS didn't exist before, and before them that Al-Qaeda emerged in the 80s, and before that Hizb ut-Tahrir emerged in 1953. Before that, the Muslim Brotherhood emerged in 1928. Before 1928, and in fact, for many years, the 30s and the 40s, and those of you who have had any interaction, whether through military careers or through any form of foreign service, with Muslim-majority societies in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and then obviously the 80s, everything starts to change. You will remember the days when countries such as Pakistan produced great female heads of state, such as Benazir Bhutto, who was, has been sadly assassinated. was president of the Oxford Union. Imran Khan was the cricket captain, and the country was seen as, with great optimism, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and these great leaders who had their faults as well. But these were secular societies. Abdel Nasser in Egypt, with all his faults, these were secular societies, and something changed. And whatever it was that changed demonstrates one thing, that it wasn't always like this. And it is possible for it to change again, but that doesn't come free. That means people are going to have to stand, people are going to have to start fighting back against this intellectually, culturally, which is where the real battle is, not militarily. That will happen anyway. But the real battle is the cultural battle, and it requires people like you, like me, like us, to stand up and actually have these debates, have these conversations.
It's interesting because you speak of this in an interview that I came across following the anti-Semitic attacks in Copenhagen. And you asserted that it's actually really important to speak of that fear that we talk about, that it's that it's the unspoken fear, that even President Obama said that those anti-Semitic attacks have nothing to do with Islam, where in fact, they are a form of Islam, call it Islamism. And our failure to identify that, to name it, results in non-Muslims identifying the whole religion as
it's one of the huge failures of the Obama administration. And look, I speak as a Liberal Democrat candidate who just fantastically lost an election in London. In fact, my entire party plummeted. We were decimated. A 15% drop in our ratings. Our deputy prime minister, who used to be deputy prime minister, is now, within one day, no longer deputy prime minister, no longer leader of the party. It was a complete, nightmare. But speaking as a Liberal Democrat, I'm very critical of President Obama's take on a lot of this. Now, who here has either read the Harry Potter books or seen the films? Great, come on. So half of you are lying, seriously. More of you had to have seen. Now, in those, I've read all the books, right? I'm not ashamed to say so. In those books, the bad, evil character is called Voldemort. And Voldemort is so bad, is so evil, that everyone is petrified of even mentioning his name. And it takes a 10-year-old kid, an 11-year-old kid called Harry Potter, to call him by his name and say Voldemort. Up until Harry Potter comes along, everyone's saying, he who must not be named. And secondly, they're saying, not even alive. So they're denying he who must not be named even exists, though they can't even name him, right? That's how bad the hysteria and the fear was of this character called Voldemort. A, there's a denial he even exists, and B, even if he did exist, you can't name him. And the genius of J.K. Rowling in that book is the consequences of that hysteria and fear is that it actually achieves exactly what what Voldemort wants to achieve, which is this near mythological fear of him and his invincibility. Now, I've taken that as an analogy and said that what President Obama has fallen prey to is the Voldemort effect. It's no use after jihadists are executing people on the streets of Europe to cries of Allahu Akbar to say the ideology of extremism needs to be stopped if you're the leader of the United States of America. It's no use. You're succumbing to the he who must not be named. The ideology of extremism is so vague that it leaves it open to such an interpretation. You end up with men in military fatigues standing outside Phoenix Mosque with guns because the ideology of extremism to them is every Muslim. In fact, it has two consequences if we cannot name and isolate this phenomenon. The first, and actually the one I'm concerned most about, is within Muslim societies. And the second is without. Within Muslim societies, what it does is it disempowers those liberal voices who wish to retain their Muslim identity, yet challenge this extremism and isolate it. And to isolate something, we've got to be able to name it. So those liberal, reforming Muslim voices, such as Malala Yousafzai, such as every feminist Muslim, every gay Muslim, every liberal Muslim. Of course, Iran will tell you there's no such thing as a gay Muslim. But those voices need to be able to identify Islamic fundamentalism and the Islamist ideology to say, this is what we're against. This is what we want you to help us resist, so that they can bring the average, everyday, ordinary Muslim on their side. And to not name that ideology fundamentally disempowers them, because it denies them a lexicon through which to express their grievances. So the first betrayal is of every Malala Yousafzai young schoolgirl out there, if we cannot name this ideology. The second consequence is without, and it's what you mentioned, Farah. The second consequence is that the average, everyday Joe Bloggs, who doesn't know the nuances of this conversation, will assume when he hears the extremist ideology, he'll say, that's Islam. It's those Muslims. Let's go and protest those Muslims. And that's what's happening, not just here, but it's happening across Europe. Now, as a result, we see the rise of far-right street protest movements, movements such as the English Defence League and Britain First in the United Kingdom, movements such as Golden Dawn in Greece, which is a neo-Nazi organization that actually came to power, Pegida in Germany. These are the return of right-wing fascism and identity politics. These are people that want to ban the Quran. These are people that want to expel all Muslims from Europe. And because for them, the extremist ideology simply means Islam itself. And so there is that what happens when you succumb to the Voldemort effect is we increase the fear, we increase the hysteria. And so one of my main criticisms of President Obama is his failure to name this ideology and thereby develop a policy to actually address this ideology ideologically. But instead there's been a misdiagnosis that we're dealing with an extremist faction, which is a fringe, called Al-Qaeda-inspired extremism. And that's really unfortunate, because Al-Qaeda didn't inspire extremism. Extremism inspired Al-Qaeda. And it's the extremism we need to be worrying about, the Islamist ideology. Al-Qaeda was an end product, is no longer the end product. Now we've got ISIS. And that's the problem when you start talking about Al-Qaeda-inspired extremism, you're not addressing the root, which is this ideology.
And to that end, I would thank you for coining the term Islamism, and comparing it to Islam as a whole, comparing it to jihadism, separating those two. But that takes us to the question of identity, because I can't help but think that a big part of the problem is identity. The fact that identity has been narrowed down so much just in the last 3 decades, that people no longer identify themselves in nationalistic terms. In the past, in the Middle East, it was really communism or a form of communism, such as Baathism, that got intertwined with Islam, and now it's Islamism. And it's gone even further down. It's Shia and Sunni, and it's gone even further down. It's Al-Qaeda versus ISIS, and so on. So with that need to identify yourself with an even smaller group, and I see that in the US as well, not just on the Muslim side. How do we step away from that? How do we get away from identifying ourselves so narrowly?
That's a good question, because so I've made it very forcefully kind of said that Islamism is what I take issue with, not with Islam, the religion. When I speak in that way, I mean I'm talking legally. I'm talking kind of what we need to combat is Islamism. That doesn't mean that I think that religious conservative fundamentalist Muslims, even if they're not Islamists, are where I would like them to be. No, I as a liberal, in a classical sense of liberalism, meaning somebody who values individual autonomy and individual freedoms, I think there's still a long way that somebody who believes in arranged marriages, for example, needs to head. Or somebody who doesn't shake the hand of women, or somebody who doesn't think women should be left alone with, or shouldn't have guy friends. I think there's a long way that person still needs to travel in their own journey. All I mean is that my combative self isn't focused on them, it's focused on Islamists. But I suppose my conversational self would still want to have a conversation with those guys and say, really, you need to consider readjusting some of your views on our common faith. And that touches on this issue, which is the rise of identity politics. What's happening of late across the world, I think in reaction to globalization, is that people are retreating to comfortable identities that they're singling out, and they feel comfortable with that one that feels familiar. And so, whereas I've witnessed, and I've played my role in this shift, I've witnessed in the UK where our communities went from being British Asians. So, by the way, when we say Asians in Europe, we mean South Asians. So here, Asians means something different. But in the UK, the Asians we have are the South Asians, meaning Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshis. So they were called British Asians. And then they became British Pakistanis. And then they became British Muslims. Well, actually, first they became just Muslims, first, full stop. And now these days they call themselves British Muslims. And that shift in identity, when they were British Asians, right? So I remember growing up where weddings were mixed interfaith. They were gender mixed, there was music. These are weddings organized by Muslims, by British Pakistani Muslims. There was music, there was dance, which would have been the same in Iraq, right? It was a festive occasion to celebrate weddings. And they've become such somber occasions. It's now rare for a Muslim wedding in the United Kingdom to have music and dance. There used to be, we used to go to Hindu weddings, Hindus would come to our weddings, my parents' generation would mix in that way. And the communities have slowly started to self-segregate, insisting on one identity above all others. For the Muslims, it's the Muslim identity, and others have their own. Now, you don't have to be an Islamist to have to succumb to that particular trap. And I call this is a tribal Muslim identity that's emerging. But we see it playing out across the world. And the rise of far-right fascist groups in Europe is a similar thing. In fact, Scotland recently tried to break away from the United Kingdom. Prioritizing their Scottish identity over their British one. And in Burma, we have the Burmese Buddhists prioritizing their Buddhist identity against the Rohingya Muslims who are now being persecuted there. So the rise of identity politics, I think, is very, very unhealthy. And actually, it's dividing people rather than bringing people together. So what we would better do is focus instead on values. And the values I refer to here, for me, would be what I call the democratic culture. Those values that underpin democracy. Democracy is not just having or holding elections. In fact, elections is the end result of democracy. Democracy is not possible if it doesn't rest on the culture of democracy. That means the freedom of speech to campaign for your political convictions, the freedom of association to join the political party you believe in, checks and balances and the rule of law, and the right to hold rulers to account so that you don't get arrested for campaigning for the political party you believe in. This is all the culture of democracy. And it's those values that will bring us together, and not necessarily emphasizing one or another of our various identities, because actually everyone is really has multiple identities, and we should cherish those multiple identities.
One question we get often here is, what is the attraction and especially we get at this more, with regard to young women, what is the attraction of ISIS that has invited young women from the US, more so from the UK? I believe you said today 2,000. British people have moved to Syria or Iraq for ISIS. What is the attraction, and how do you manage to radicalize somebody who is raised with a certain form of morality, as you were, I'm sure? How were you radicalized at the age of 16 to adopt such extremist views?
So I'm hearing two parts to that. And the first is what is the attraction, and then the micro level is what happens in someone's mind. But the first part is important to talk about. We have between 1,000 to 2,000 British-born and raised citizens just from the United Kingdom, which in landmass I think is smaller than the state of Texas, by the way. Imagine 1,000, obviously population-wise it's a lot more. But 1,000 to 2,000 British-born and raised Muslims have gone to join ISIS. That's just from the United Kingdom. And then you add that to the numbers from across Europe, and that's why you had the French Prime Minister saying that by the end of the year it could be up to 10,000 from across Europe. British born and raised, or European born and raised citizens who are leaving the comfort of their homes to join the worst terrorist group that we could ever have imagined. How does one get to that situation? No insurgency can ever succeed or can ever sustain itself if it doesn't benefit from a level of support from within its host community. 2,000 or 1,000 British citizens don't just get up and leave to join ISIS from a vacuum. That just doesn't happen. They don't self-radicalize on the internet. There's a lot of myths in this industry, by the way, right? Self-radicalization on the internet. You don't just suddenly, 2,000 people, one day they look at the internet and they decide to go and chop off heads in Iraq and Syria. This has happened because for decades upon decades in the United Kingdom, across Europe and actually across the world, the Islamist ideology has been peddling its propaganda unchecked on the grassroots to a point now where the default form of expression for many young British Muslims is the caliphate. They romanticize the notion of the caliphate pretty much like idealistic young teenagers in the 60s romanticized the USSR and Soviet communism as the utopia. So it's not uncommon to hear objections to ISIS, as you alluded to earlier, Farah, objections to ISIS not because they seek to establish a theocratic caliphate, but simply because they're going about it the wrong way. So many Muslims who are vocal against ISIS, if you were to interrogate them on what they think of the caliphate itself, they'd say to you, well, of course, it's a duty. Everyone believes in the caliphate. We just disagree with ISIS because, they're enslaving Yazidi women. We want to create our own theocracy in our own way. And to the point where Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda's branch in Syria, is fighting and killing ISIS fighters who are fighting and killing Al-Qaeda fighters. But both want the caliphate. Let's not be fooled. The term moderation has come to mean nothing if it's all relative to ISIS. And today there's a danger that we see Jabhat al-Nusra or the Al-Qaeda wing in Syria as the moderates just because they're against ISIS. And if moderation is relative to ISIS, the term has lost all meaning. What we really should be focusing on instead is the values. What is it that people are subscribing to? And if it's not democratic culture, then we cannot, in all reason, in a reasonable sense any sense, use the word moderate to describe them. So for decades in Britain, among the grassroots, this notion of caliphate has become a point now where 15-year-old schoolgirls who leave East London to go and join ISIS, it's no surprise to me that one of their fathers of these 15-year-old schoolgirls, right? So he's on television complaining of his woes and his tribulations that his daughter's gone to join ISIS. And then there was it was released eventually in the media that this same father who was expressing this shock that his daughter had gone to join ISIS, a year or so before that, was filmed in a protest standing next to the man who murdered drummer Lee Rigby by attempting to chop his head off in the streets. And he was at a protest where they were burning American flags. So this is the father whose daughter ended up going to join ISIS, and he's surprised. And this is my point, that if you're emerging from an atmosphere or milieu in which ideas or notions of this caliphate are romanticized, that's the norm, why be surprised when someone then suddenly decides to declare the caliphate? Of course, those of a younger generation to you, if that's all they've ever known, many of them, too many of them, will flock to join this caliphate that you've spent your entire life romanticizing. And so that's really the issue here. That's what's been going on. And I know, because I played my role. And I'll finish on this point, actually, because my life has come to symbolize exactly what's happened in this story. When I first started out with Hizb ut-Tahrir, and I joined at 16 years old, we used to stand outside mosques, distributing leaflets, proselytizing for our very politicized version of the religion. At around 17, 18 years old, a bearded religious man exited this mosque, and just imagine what you're thinking now if I say bearded religious man, right? And the image that comes to you and your minds in 2015. Back then, he walked straight up to me and punched me in the face. He said, "How dare you politicize our religion?" And he punched me in the face. Now, fast forward to 2010, 2011, and I'm in Pakistan, trying to do the opposite, undo the damage that I played a role in. And I was punched again in the face. And this time, I was knocked to the floor this time. The guy was an amateur boxer. And he punched me in the face and says, "How dare you try and separate politics from our religion?" But that's what's happened in the space of one lifetime. When we first started proselytizing for the caliphate when I was 16 years old, nobody had heard of the term, nobody knew what it meant. My parents looked at me, my mum slapped me around the face as well. She said, don't you dare join that organization. I didn't listen to her. I get slapped around the face a lot, unfortunately. But nobody had heard of what this caliphate was, and within one lifetime, you see what it's resulted in. But that also gives me cause for optimism, because I think it can be reversed as well.
It's interesting you say that, though, because one thing that we discussed earlier was the fact that even when I went to university in the UK, that was early 90s, mid 90s, there was an extreme opposition by the British Asian student community to my having any involvement with the Islamic Society, because I wasn't a proper Muslim, I wasn't covered.
Yeah, and saying proper in quotation.
Proper in quotation, yeah, of course. As well as, questioning heritage and so on. I recall even bringing Jews that had converted to Islam and Muslims that had converted to Judaism or Christianity.
And we had put into prison, were they?
Well, we had to get security because things got. Well, there you go, exactly. So even then, even in those days, I found that in the UK, which is it's very different from the US, that integration of the British Asians, and these are first generation Brits, is limited. Whereas over here, people identify themselves as Americans. I did not see that in the UK.
Used to. It's true that things here were a lot better than they are in Europe. But just today, the police in Boston have shot somebody dead who had been planning to do something, and he surprised them. They weren't actually going to arrest him. They were actually just going to ask him some questions. He pulled out an army knife. And they have video footage of him lunging at the police with it, and they had to react. And, we know what happened at this, it's ridiculous, this Draw Muhammad cartoon protest that Pam Geller organized. But nevertheless, as I said on Twitter at the time, bigots have the right to be bigots without being shot at. And that's really the issue here, that, you've got the right to have your views about my prophet, and I have to take that because this is what the consequences of free society. I mean, we grew up watching Life of Brian. Have anyone seen Life of Brian? I mean, we can laugh at that. Why can't we laugh at anything else as Muslims? So, that's really the consistent stance to take. But I say used to because it's creeping over here. And the reason it's creeping over here is that one of the consequences of globalization, of social media, of this, what I call the digital native generation. What do I mean by digital natives? We all probably remember a time, actually, some of you probably don't, some of you look younger than I am, but we all remember a time, I do, and perhaps you do, Farah, when there wasn't the internet. I certainly remember a time when I didn't have a smartphone. I remember the time when the trendiest, coolest mobile phone that anyone could ever own was this big. And you had to, you can manually extend the plastic aerial upwards. Right, so anyone who's 18 right now is probably looking at me thinking, what? That was cool, but it actually really was. And you had to physically pull this aerial up and then you'd hold it to your ear like a brick. What do I mean by digital natives? It's people for whom the internet is as normal as television was for us. People who cannot recall a time when there wasn't email, when there wasn't the internet, when there weren't smartphones. They are digital natives, and therefore, by definition, they will be a lot more fluent in their use of the internet. And that's the generation that's joining ISIS. That generation is fully connected to the European Muslim discourse. And so why I say we mustn't take it for granted is that up until now, American Muslims have benefited from that relative isolation from some of the extremism that was prevalent in the European Muslim discourse, but not anymore. And it's very worrying, because you do have Americans who've gone to join ISIS, but also you have a lot more who are sympathizing with them on Twitter. So when research has been done for Twitter accounts that are supportive of ISIS, proportionately, more are American than they are European, proportionately. So it's a very worrying trend that things are beginning to change.
Actually, that takes us to the next question. Interesting definition of Islamists. Do you think there are Christianists or Hinduists? And do you focus on or know of any groups that focus on this mindset? Many Christianists, one would say, probably hold seats in the US government. Should we be worried?
Are these questions from the audience, by the way?
This is all. Great, anything blue is from the audience. I was worried that there
weren't going to be time for you guys, but that's good. We've got lots here. And look, there's certainly in India, let's start with the Hindu part of that question. Certainly in India, there is a rise in identity politics among the Hindus. And in fact, when identity politics it arises in this way, they have a symbiotic relationship with each other. They feed into each other. They need each other to exist. So Anders Breivik, who shot all those innocent children in Norway, had a manual, right? And when he was arrested, they found his manual. He wanted it to be the manifesto that sparked the war in Europe. And in that manifesto, he cites in glowing admirational terms Al-Qaeda. Here's a man whose very call to arms is to resist Muslims, yet he's citing in respectful terms, Al-Qaeda's military strategy in his own manual to kill Muslims. But that's what I mean by the symbiotic relationship. They feed each other. How they do that is because, of course, if the Islamist is saying all non-Muslims hate Muslims and therefore we must fight them, then on the other end, people like Breivik are saying all Muslims want to take us over. Look, here's Al-Qaeda saying they want to take us over, so we've got to fight them. So they need each other as proof that they are correct about the other. And that symbiotic relationship exists between the far-right fascist terrorists like Breivik in Europe and Al-Qaeda, and also with some Hindu extremists in India who do the same thing with there have been communal riots in India. I mean, part of the thing that radicalized me was the destruction of the Barbary Mosque in India and the huge communal riot that emerged from them with the loss of many, many Muslim lives. The genocide in Bosnia. So actually identity politics isn't just restricted to Muslims. I do draw a distinction, however, between the ism of Islamism and Muslim fundamentalists. The distinction I draw is that, and Christian fundamentalists likewise, because you can be a fundamentalist that I'll find possessing some pretty repugnant views, but you could also not want to impose those views by law over everyone else. That's one set of challenges, which is distinct as a set of challenges from those who want to impose it on everyone else. Now, Muslims have both. Muslims have fundamentalists among them, and they have the Islamists among them who want to impose that on everyone else. And so in that sense, I think that what America on the Christian right is dealing more so with is definitely the rise of Christian fundamentalism and their influence on, in some cases, on the Republican Party, which is cause for concern. And how they feed into each other is a matter that all of us should be aware of. You know, if any of us take the view, and of course you have the right to this view, but I would question its credibility as a view. If we have the view that Muslims are inherently here to take over, and therefore we must take over first, that's the type of narrative that feeds into the Islamist narrative, pretty much like Breivik, right, when he used the same line of argument. And all it succeeds in doing is pulling people apart. And I think what we really should focus on is on what we have in common, is what I call the democratic culture, and those classically liberal values of respect for individual rights and autonomy, and see how those can bring us together. And that's a that's a harder route to take. My wife, Rachel, often reminds me that, you know, whenever I get angry, but she's right, you know, she's right. It's the harder route to take, and we have to take it.
I'm going to combine two questions here. Can you comment on the Shia-Sunni issues and the future of that conflict? And where do you see ISIS 3, 5, or 10 years from now?
These are related questions, and there's an optimistic view and a pessimistic view, and I'll give you both, and then you can make your own minds up. Taking it back to the life of Brian, you know, there's a scene in that movie where the Judean People's Front are confronting the People's Front of Judea, and one is calling the other a splitter. Anyone remember that scene? Yeah. And it leaves you with the optimistic feeling that sectarianism will inherently destroy itself, which is pretty much like Al-Qaeda now fighting ISIS. And in Afghanistan, by the way, the Taliban are fighting ISIS, and they're killing each other as well. So it's the Judean People's Front versus the People's Front of Judea. And so the optimistic view would be that sectarianism is inherently flawed and will destroy itself, and when it does, it's an opportunity for us to step in and save the day. The pessimistic view is that North Korea still exists and has done so for decades and decades and decades. And that closed societies, that there's nothing inevitable about closed societies destroying themselves. They can sustain themselves, albeit, you know, very closed and dark and totalitarian, but they can stay there. And that's the pessimistic view, that there's nothing inevitable about progress. What I would argue is, you know, I'm still deciding which one's correct out of those two, but I would say that we certainly can't afford to take it for granted. There's nothing fatalistic about what's going on. You know, the rise of sectarianism in Iraq and Syria, and the divisions of the Shia and the Sunnah in the entire region, and in Pakistan as well. There's nothing inevitable that we can't afford at least to assume that it's inevitable, that will play itself out. Rather, we don't have a choice but to stand forward and struggle to try and bring people together again. That's the only option that's available to us, because I don't think we can afford the risk. And I don't think that I'm aware of any example where things have just sorted themselves out. I don't think I'm aware of any example where that's happened. It always requires people making the effort. So it's unfortunate that sectarianism has risen in the Middle East, there is an opportunity there. There's an opportunity that when somebody does stand up and say, hold on, this looks a bit like the Judean People's Front against the People's Front of Judea, that we seize on that. We seize on that and we turn it into those 5 factors I mentioned in my brief presentation. That we develop the ideas and the narratives, and we generate the leaders, and we help with the symbols, and we help develop the vision for democratic activism in the Middle East. But that will require us committing our energies to it and paying it some attention.
We had Professor Karima Benoon here right shortly after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, which you had spoken about quite a bit. And she was stressing on the importance of dialogue. And I understand that that is something that Quillian is focusing on as well. So in that realm of dialogue, how successful have you been when talking to Muslim communities, especially back in the UK?
Yeah, so dialogue is important, but more important than dialogue is critical engagement. Because if dialogue was the aim, then all of you, I'm sure, would be very disgusted right now if sitting here on the stage with me, instead of being the wonderfully articulate and incredibly skillful Farah, was a neo-Nazi skinhead espousing racist views, and I was just sitting here dialoguing in a friendly manner. You'd find that repugnant. So dialogue, whereas actually, if I was debating this neo-Nazi skinhead, you'd be cheering me on. That's the difference between critical engagement and just dialogue. Now, for too long, what's been happening is that we've all felt very comfortable, incredibly comfortable, shouting down that neo-Nazi skinhead. We felt that that's in fact our duty to do so. It's a civic imperative. Even though it's legal in the United States and across Europe to remain convinced that neo-Nazism is the correct way forward for mankind. And I will give you that right. You can think that if you want, but I will shout you down if you believe it. But that's where we've got to in that debate. The distinction between legal tolerance, to legally tolerate a repugnant idea, and, on the other hand, civic intolerance. That in civil society we don't tolerate these repugnant ideas, though we defend their legal right to hold them. Now, unfortunately, with Muslims, and Islamist extremism in particular, the debate hasn't reached that level. And so too often, when those on the liberal side of the debate, my own side of this debate, dialogue with Islamists, it is simply dialogue. And what they're not doing is calling out through a process of critical engagement, what they're not doing is calling out their bigotry. Now, Islamists and the Islamist ideology is a fundamentally repugnant, bigoted idea, as it would be, as any theocratic principle would be. Anyone who subscribes to a view that they have the right to enforce their version of religion over you, even if they claim, it's okay, I'll give you some rights. You know, they can essentially they need to take that idea and throw it out the window, because to patronize you by saying, oh, I'll give you some rights, I mean, the nature of theocracy is fundamentally flawed. So in engaging with dialogue with Islamists, that point has to be made. And for too long, from fear of appearing racist, from fear of appearing culturally intolerant, Islamists haven't been challenged in that way. And I don't mean terrorists here when I'm talking about this, because of course everyone condemns violence. So by the way, on a side note, I don't deserve a thank you from anyone in this audience for saying I don't want to kill you. See how low our bar has sunk? That what we're expecting from Muslims is you must condemn violence, you must condemn terrorism. No, that must be the default. We need to take the debate to the Islamist ideology itself. If anyone is talking to anyone who romanticizes notions of enforcing any version of Islam over society, even if they say it via democracy, via elections, you know, what, like the Muslim Brotherhood did in Egypt, they got elected and then they say no women can become president. Jews and Christians have to pay a head tax called the jizya. This is separating between citizens based on their religion. They call them Ahl al-Kitab, right? The Jews and the Christians. What about people that are neither? Which category do they fit into? Yazidis? You want to enslave them instead? So we've got to take the debate down to the level of the ideas and move beyond this notion, what I call the poverty of expectation, that where the good Muslim is the one that condemns terrorism, we're happy with him because we have such a low expectation of them in the first place. We're expecting them to defend terrorism. Let's move the debate forward and say, well, let's discuss the ideas of democratic culture and what that means to you. And if we find that in that dialogue, they say things like, you know, if by popular election, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood's elected, and they choose that women can't be heads of state, you know, we mustn't patronize that view. We must challenge that view where we come across it. So that's the sort of dialogue I subscribe to. I don't subscribe to the kind of valueless dialogue. No, I think we need to have critical engagement. And the second part of the question was?
I forgot actually what the second part was.
Yeah. But if I missed anything out, please.
I am sorry. I think we discussed that already, but I am very conscious of the time, unfortunately. I will just take one last question. Would you comment on the US Supreme Court decision to protect religious freedom, wearing headscarves, and does it help your cause?
So, again, I read this. I read the summary of the judgment, and it was I think Justice Clarence Thomas. Anyway, there was one dissenting judge, and the rest were for the vote. And what they said was, we don't want to go down the route of France. And I found that impressive because, of course, there is this thing in France where headscarves are banned in any public place. Now, I've taken the view, kind of a long time ago, I took the view that as bad as Islamists wanting to impose the headscarf on women are those who, in the name of secularism, will tell women that they're not allowed to wear the headscarf. I think actually religious freedom, if it means anything at all, is to give people the choice. And the very reason, through the human rights engagement I had with Amnesty, is what it had that profound impact on me and changed me, is that that's what religious freedom means. And so that's the weapon I'm using against Islamists, is to say, you have the right to practice your religion, just don't impose it on others. Otherwise, how would you like it if it was imposed on you and the headscarf was banned? And so the good thing with France is it allows me to give that as an example of the opposite of Islamism. And so American secularism and British secularism is very different to French secularism. And we have to make that point when we use the word secularism. It means different things to different people. In the Urdu language, there isn't a word for secularism in the sense that you guys understand it. The Urdu word for secularism is la diniyat, which means no religion, which is the French version of it, right? Laïcité.
And there isn't in Arabic either.
Al-Maniyya in Arabic is slightly better.
Yep. More like Scientology.
Yeah, it's kind of, or scientificism, scientific, yeah. It's a bit kind of, Al-Maniyya is kind of, knowledge-based society, which is fine. It doesn't mean anti-religion inherently. Right. Whereas in Urdu, it means no religion. And so when we use the word secularism and an Urdu speaker translates it, they think we're saying you cannot practice your religion, we're going to ban you from it. Because they don't have a word other than la diniyat. And so again, it's important that even in engaging in this critical engagement that I talk about, that we define what we're talking about when we say it. So I choose American secularism, I choose British secularism, I don't choose French secularism. Having said that, I will end on a note and say that I wish women didn't feel like they had to cover their hair, personally. But that's separate to their legal right to do so.
And I wish people would stop telling women what to do, but that's
exactly. So notice I did say I wish they didn't feel like they had to. It is their choice, but the notion that somehow they feel, if there is a pressure, they feel that it makes them somehow better a person in the eyes of God is what I question. I don't think religiously it's mandated, but the issue is that, of course, the law must protect anyone's right to practice their religion in any way whatsoever.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you very much for an amazing conversation.
Thank you.